everyone. So we are now at the last week of the summer session, and we are at our last chapter, which is chapter 7. I do want to tell you, first of all, that I appreciate all of your diligence during the last 6 weeks. Appreciate all your hard work, and I hope that you finish strong. You really want to do that. Don't step off now. This is just a few more days and we're done. So then you have a few weeks before the start of the next semester. So I hope you've been benefiting from this and have gained some knowledge about how we go about comparing all different types of aspects of governments and countries and various ways we compare all types of parts of the political system. So it's important for us to do comparison. It's how we grow as a society. It's how we evaluate what works and doesn't work, particularly within democratic systems, for example. But also helps us be able to protect ourselves from the systems non-democratic systems that we find to be adversarial. So there's a lot of pros to being able to understand and investigate how other countries operate, which is really the core of what comparative politics is. It's like world politics, but in the context of understanding and analyzing all the other countries and how they do and operate the way they do. So in chapter 7 deals with political identity, nationalism, and religion, and class, and how they play into the various aspects of societies around the world. And it really is really the crux of why we have conflict as well. I mean, most of the conflicts that we have happened throughout human history are based on various aspects, or sometimes one or two, sometimes all of them play into why we discriminate, or why civil wars occur, or even why world wars occur, are based on the premise that happens in understanding how we identify ourselves. Even within the United States, let's say, for example, when we talk about political identity, well, what does that mean? Well, in our own society, we have primarily the two big entities or interest groups are the Democrats and Republicans. Democrats, of course, are the liberals, and Republicans are the conservatives, more or less, and so they are at odds with one another, and instead of sometimes collaborating and finding a nice balance, they will just go after each other, and the people who really suffer are the people, because both have good ideas and sometimes they both have bad ideas. But regardless, is when the good ideas are there, one side may completely block it off because they didn't come up with it, or just to impede the success of the other political party, not because it didn't make sense, just because they're trying to make the other party look bad. And the people who suffer are us. So when you talk about understanding the importance of political identity, this is interesting today because, to me, I would say, does it really matter if you're a Democrat or Republican or liberal or conservative? Does it really matter? But yet we pay so much heed to it. And even at a time when you see in our world today that more and more people are becoming independent and are not affiliating with one political party, because why not be a free-thinking individual and make your decisions about the people who are going to represent you by virtue of your belief system about what you value? And I think if more people did that, and less people focused on, well, I'm a Democrat or a liberal, or I'm a Republican / conservative, and all the things that they think they mean, we'd be a much better off planet. A lot of times people, don't even know what it means to be a conservative or what it means to be a liberal, and they just sort of follow whatever they see on TV, and that's a pretty dangerous precedent to set. So in this chapter, we're going to look a little bit at this and talk about it, and this is the last chapter we'll be in for this session, as I said, and so let's get to it. Okay, here we go. Questions we'll be answering, and again, I keep the PowerPoints up here for part of our discussion because it's easier to reference for all of you, and for the feedback I've gotten, a lot of students prefer it this way. So, but some of the questions we'll be answering basically are, of course, what is political identity, which I've kind of already illustrated for you. What is nationalism? What does it mean to be a citizen? what is religious identity? How does religion play into our ideas of ourselves, our societies? So, for example, when you talk about Catholicism versus Protestantism, what does that mean? Is one better than the other? Where does religious ideology come from, for example? Even within, subgroups within Islam, there are multiple different variations of what it means to be a Muslim, not just Sunni and Shia, but there are also subgroups within that too that are also peripheral to two primary groups that are looked upon within the context of Islam. And then because of that, they fight each other. More people have been killed in the name of religion throughout history than any other point in time. So it's ironic that while God may want people to love one another, it seems like people are killing more because my God is better than your God. So it's a little bit nuts, but that's exactly how the premise. Then we'll talk about the class identity and what it means, economic class versus social class. And then also what it means of identity politics regarding class. So we'll look at that as well. So let's jump into this a little bit and see what we get to. So let me jump ahead here. So when we start to look at what are some of the primary components of political identity, and why is a political identity important in studying the concept of comparative politics, that's really the essence of what this chapter is going to start with, the foundational aspects. So when we look at this, the idea of identity politics really is your political identity, and as you can see, that the people tend to want to be a part of a particular group, right? That's where we're group animals by nature. And so whether we are grouping ourselves by virtue of a religion or by race or by social background, economic background, we tend to form ourselves based on the premise of these ideologies. And then within that, we form alliances, political alliances along those lines. So even if it's race-based or whether it's religion-based, we form political alliances that allow for us to dictate policies or try to push for policies that serve our interests or the interests of the alliance. So they're slowly moving away from the traditional party-based system, party-based politics, and going more into the political alliances, which is problematic at best. And then, the idea of living within a pluralist society, meaning that there are so many different variations in diversity of people and groups, which potentially could be the beauty of society if people respected each of the individual entities. The problem is that people tend to be very narrowed in their view, and anybody who challenges or disagrees with their view or has a different view of the picture tends to be considered an adversary instead of just being different. And then we have what's called hyperpluralists, and these are, again, societies where groups have priorities that are so divergent that it's impossible to compromise or reach agreement. And so they tend to be basically societies that tend to be failing because they don't have the mechanisms in place to be able to sustain themselves or to cooperate and move forward as a society. So when democracies tend to fail, this is really one of the byproducts of failed democracies, or the precursor to a failed democracy is that you have these sort of hyper-pluralist groups that exist within certain societies. I love this, the veil of ignorance, because Martin Luther King famously said that there's nothing more dangerous in the world than sincere ignorance or conscientious stupidity. This is one of those things where, in these hypothetical systems, that people are sort of asked to make policy decisions without knowing how they would impact the rest of the world. So you make decisions without realizing that the impact of those decisions might affect other places, or the long-term result of that decision may be much more problematic than the short-term result. And so that's another one of the key aspects of being ignorant to the long-term potential effects. And the premise has always been, or the argument is that people would create fair policies without respect to class or race or ethnicity or so forth, if it wasn't for this sort of veil of ignorance. I don't know. That's an interesting point. It depends on I thought about human beings and human nature. many people would argue that human beings are pretty not that good about this kind of stuff. So it'd be interesting to kind of discuss that at further length. Uh, so when we talk about the question of what is national identity, well, national identity is several things. So your national identity, of course, is the identity of your country, right? It's like how we see ourselves as members of a nation, like we're Americans in the United States, for example. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things, and some of those things are problematic. I would argue, we wrap it around the idea of patriotism. Well, what does patriotism really mean? Well, we're sort of socialized in the time that we, grow up, and certainly from kindergarten on, we're, America is the best place on the planet, and we have the Pledge of Allegiance. We have all these things and mechanisms that dictate or suggest uh, that we are the best, and we build around our society so that everybody thinks America is the place to come to, and we're just amazing. um, but again, there are problems associated with the idea of what we call this idea of national identity. Is my national identity better than your national identity? And if America, and in America, we have this thing called American exceptionalism, where, it's like people in America tend to have to act like they're better than the rest of the people on the planet. And they used to call it back after World War II when America, Americans were all over Europe after World War II, after saving Europe. They used to call them the ugly Americans because Americans would come over and treat the rest of the Europeans like crap. And that was a real problem. And people started to see that your national identity had such significant relevance, particularly under the notion of patriotism. And couched under patriotism is a lot of things about the idea of being a patriot. It's one thing to be proud of your country, but do we sometimes take it too far? Is it more important to be a people patriot than to be a patriot just of looking at just your country? There is no perfect country, but you can try to be a good country, and that's a different kind of thing completely. Um, but even within our own national identity, we have subgroups, right? So some people don't want other people to be American, so they want to dictate what it is to be an American. As a matter of fact, we're one of the few countries on the planet that spends all its time trying to separate what it means to be an American. So you have African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, all these different groups that are Americans. And the only time we're ever just Americans is when we go to war. So what does it really mean to have a national identity? What is our national identity? Is it mom and apple pie? Or what really does it mean to be an American today? And I don't think we have a really good answer for that. I think we haven't done a very good job of really ascertaining where that intersection comes, where those interconnections are. I think we've figured out more how to separate ourselves than unite ourselves today. And so without that, it's very hard, it's hard to live in a very diluted society to form a common national identity, even though we're 150 years past the Civil War and the slavery ended approximately at that time, but we still are fighting in some ways the Civil War. And we have limited our view of what our national identity is compared to other countries. And some of them are smaller and less progressive than we are in terms of our abilities, but they have a much richer vision of their national identity. Maybe because we're a young country. We're only, we're not even 300 years old compared to other countries that have thousands of years of history and have formed their identities long before we even came into existence. So that may also be part of the reality. And so again, so the sense of national identity, certainly if you think about it on a sociological level, the idea of belonging, the belonging to a group, the symbolism that comes with it, people salute the flags and it sort of sets up your value, what your nation values and the priorities of the nation and under its identity. These are all things that are important in their own way, but also potentially dangerous in terms of how we utilize them. And then when we get to the term nationalism, and nationalism is an ideology that basically says that an individual or group their devotion and loyalty to the state proves to be more important than their own personal interest. So under this, the notion that the natural development of having a national identity is the most important thing. And the stronger the national identity, the stronger your sense of nationalism. And then, nationalism is one of those things that I would argue, again, can lead very dangerously to things like racism, and again, even, my country's better than your country kind of nonsense, because it sort of focuses much more on the country and the identity of the country than it does on the people. And so we sort of we put a lens on there that really creates a dividing line between us and other nations, as opposed to a bond between us and other nations. And then the idea of liberal nationalism, again, is this sort of idea that, every group of people within a national, that have a national identity, should have their own state and their own country to call their own. So that's more of a liberal, sort of progressive view of an idea of nationalism. It doesn't really exist in the altruistic world that the liberals are living in with making that assertion, but it certainly is the premise by which liberal nationalism operates under. And then there's, of course, the exclusionary nationalism, which basically is saying, like I just mentioned earlier, my country is better than yours. Like we call it, like, for example, American exceptionalism. There are probably a few countries on the planet that have this view of the world. Certainly, I know us, probably China, in some ways, Russia. So in other words, I would say the eight to 10 richest countries on the planet probably have a sense of exceptionalism compared to other countries that have less resources and are not as developed. I'm sure that we have a much stronger sense of these ideas. So again, nationalism, can be a force for the creation of a new and independent system or a new independent state. Especially under the use of these various separatist movements that we've seen happen all around the world. This one happened in Spain, and Catalonia is a separate region within Spain, and they wanted their own independence from Spain because they are distinct, even though they have bloodlines, that they want to be seen as a distinct separate culture and have their own separate state. These can have positive and negative effects, of course. In the United States, of course, the South tried to do that and led to a civil war that led to almost 700,000 people dying. So there are consequences for your independence, especially if you don't control all the resources to be able to be independent. And again, I've always spoke to this regarding patriotism, and they call it pride in one's nationalism. But I would argue that it's our pride in one state, or nation, but it's also it can be very blinding, because people will wrap that around and apply so many different meanings to it that, when you try to, when you want to control the masses, it's easier to control them under the auspices of patriotism than it is almost anything, because you can basically take out any rational discussion about whether we're good or bad as a nation by simply wrapping patriotism around everybody, get them to feel good and salute the flag and do all these things, and then all of a sudden everything changes. So that's problematic. And then citizenship is basically that when you're from certain countries, have certain political identities,